to the Lucky Campbell Show. Tonight, I'm on the campus of St. FX University. And more specifically, the Schwartz School Auditorium. I'm here tonight to observe Dr. Burnley Rocky Jones giving a lecture in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. It is an honor for me to videotape this historic event, and I hope you will enjoy it.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending tonight and braving the cold. I know it's really chilly out there tonight. So we're here tonight to honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I would like to welcome Mr. Jones, who is our speaker tonight, and Marie Brunau, who is our Human Rights and Equity Advisor, will give welcoming remarks.
So it is cold, but it's not stormy. So we have to think positive. So thanks for being here to celebrate with us the Martin Luther King Jr. Day. This year, I have the great privilege to organize this event with Rashida Glasgow-Simons, the new, I would say, we still call her new, the Black Student Advisor. Yeah, she's fairly new. She joined ZFX just last November, moving from Halifax, where she was a teacher. So the ZFX community is quite thrilled to have her aboard. We both thought that it was still quite relevant and important to celebrate this year again Martin Luther King Jr. Day on campus. As you may know, this is an American civic holiday observed on the third Monday of January each year, marking the birthday of Reverend King, which is the January 15. And Martin Luther King Day was last Monday on the 21st. So as you know, Martin Luther King is best known for his 1963 famous speech, I have a dream of a racially equitable society. King was the chief spokesman for nonviolent activism in the civil rights movement, which successfully protested racial discrimination in federal and state laws. He is indeed one of the major key players who has prompted the 1964 Civil Rights Act. In the same year, he received the Nobel Peace Prize for his work to end racial segregation through civil disobedience and other nonviolence means. Rashida found an interview of him explaining what is civil disobedience and the notion or his notion of just and unjust laws. So I think it's quite relevant for us to hear about that. Maybe we can relate that to the movement Idle No More now, which is a movement, I guess, of civil disobedience in a way. Reverend King and the civil rights movement, like the Freedom Riders, had a major impact not only in the state but also in Canada. The adoption in the state of this Civil Rights Act prompted Canada to adopt its own legislation to protect the human rights. So in the 60s, every province adopted its own legislation. Nova Scotia adopted its first human rights legislation in 1967. But at home in Canada, there was also a civil rights movement, and I think Rocky Jones was part of it. In fact, he became one of the best-known freedom fighters in the Canadian civil rights movement. Dr. Jones will probably tell us more about these tumultuous 60s and his quest for social change. This day, I think, is also an opportunity for all of us to reflect on the topic of racial equality. How much have we really achieved in the last 50 years? Can we claim or pretend that there is no more segregation and racism in Canada and that Nova Scotia is now a racially equitable society? What role a post-secondary institution like St. FX can play to help the African Nova Scotian population to reach this equality? Racial inequality is not something from the past or existing only in the southern states. As a province, as a community, as a university, we have to make an examination of conscience. For example, we can ask ourselves a few questions. Why at the Town Council of Antigonish there is still no Black city councillor? Why, looking at the local workforce, I would say, why there are so few Black people, like just looking in the retail business, for example, there are very few. Why so few Black faculty members and staff at St. FX? Again, why do we have, in terms of programs, Canadian studies, Catholic studies, Celtic studies, but yet no Black studies, neither Native studies? Why there are not more African Nova Scotian students at St. FX? Maybe this is because young people from the Black communities, even those who live close to our university, don't yet perceive St. FX as being totally welcoming and accepting, and therefore head elsewhere, maybe to Dal University. So for sure, we have to change together this perception and this trend. And I think in these difficult financial times, a special commitment toward the African Nova Scotian population could be also financially profitable for St. FX in terms of recruitment and enrollment. So maybe Rocky Jones could help us to reflect and maybe to find some answer to these difficult questions. So now I would like to invite Morgan Giro, who's a BED student and the president of the Black Student Society, to say a few words. Morgan?
Hi, everybody. So when I was asked to speak about the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., I didn't really have to think too hard. In an institution such as St. FX that breeds leadership and produces really great leaders, I'm surrounded by the ripple effect Dr. King has set in motion. Individuals like Mary Alice Peggy Butts, a Canadian senator, Moses Cody, the cooperative engineer, Brian Mulrooney, Prime Minister, Dr. Agnes Calise, phenomenal educator, have walked this campus leaving their imprints. As I look around now, I see students past and present, full of dreams and poised to set them in motion. I see students that will be the change that we need in this world as they work tirelessly without recognition to better our campus in the 4 short years they are here. As Dr. King was one of the many voices for African Americans, there will be people in this room that will be the voices of this generation. To quote Dr. King, we will have to repent in this generation not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. So his legacy surrounds us, his dreams are our reality, but our dreams are our future. So have one.
We are all here today to honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his legacy. One of Dr. King's main tactics during the civil rights movement included the use of civil disobedience instead of violence. One of the reasons Dr. King stood against more violent tactics was because there were a massive amount of people, particularly young people, who followed and participated in the civil rights movement. Although many men and women were killed or assaulted during the civil rights movement, Dr. King knew that many more could have been killed on a larger scale if they behaved violently during demonstrations, for example. We have a small clip now that explains Dr. King's philosophy on this. This is from the show Meet the Press. It aired March 28, 1965. In this clip, it's a little different because it's not a speech. It's him responding directly to a question from an interviewer, and really brings home his message of civil disobedience and how in some ways we have a moral condition or a moral obligation to break laws that are unjust and that are discriminatory against certain groups. So we can cue the video.
Dr. King, you said a moment ago that Alabama was a state that gives respectability to the resistance and defiance of the law. And you listed an observance of the law by local agencies in the South as one of the cardinal aims that you would seek. Yet on March the 9th, you led the second march on Montgomery in violation of a federal injunction not to march. You said that order was unjust. And John Lewis, one of your colleagues, said that the Negroes had a constitutional right to march, injunction or no injunction. Now, was that in keeping with the spirit of nonviolence and the restraint that has always characterized your movement? And could you explain your reasoning in defying the court order that day?
Well, let me say 2 things to that, Mr. Wicker. First, I did not consider myself defying the court order that particular day. I consulted with my attorneys before the march, and they stated that they felt that it was an invalid order and that it would not be, that I would not be in contempt of court of violating the court order willingness to accept the penalty. And any man who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail in order to arouse the conscience of the community on the injustice of the law is at that moment expressing the very highest respect for law.
Well, I can sympathize with a good deal of that, but it seems to me you get into a very difficult point here at which one man's conscience is set, in fact, above the conscience of society, which has invoked the law. How are we to enforce law when a doctrine is preached that one man's conscience may tell him that the law is unjust when other men's conscience don't tell them that?
I think you enforce it, and I think you deal with it by not allowing anarchy to develop. I do not believe in defying the law, as many of the segregationists do. I do not believe in evading the law, as many of the segregationists do. The fact is that most of the segregationists and racists that I see are not willing to suffer enough for their beliefs in segregation, and they are not willing to go to jail. I think the chief norm for guiding the situation is the willingness to accept the penalty. And I don't think any society can call an individual irresponsible who breaks the law and willingly accepts the penalty if conscience tells him that that law is unjust. And I think that this is a long tradition in our society. It's a long tradition in biblical history. Meshach and Abednego broke an unjust law, and they did it because they had to be true to a higher moral law. The early Christians practiced civil disobedience in a superb manner. Academic freedom would not be a reality today if it had not been for Socrates, and if it had not been for Socrates' willingness to practice civil disobedience. And I would say that in our own history, there's nothing that expresses massive civil disobedience any more than the Boston Tea Party, and yet we give this to our young people and our students as a part of the great tradition of our nation. So I think we're in good company when we break unjust laws, and I think those who are willing to do it and accept the penalty are those who are part of the saving of the nation.
So I chose that clip because unlike some others, maybe you have heard speeches before, and although it's good to hear them, I wanted to show something that maybe you hadn't heard before that really shows his intellect and also his commitment to the struggle, willing to put himself in a situation where he would be a lawbreaker and be taken to jail. And these situations where the police were not necessarily or not at all on his side, it was key that he taught people not to react in a violent nature because, as you know, many people were killed, many people were hurt. And his philosophy helped to minimize that. I would now like to introduce Augy Jones. He's a 3-time ex-graduate, also an X-Men basketball alumnus. He's currently the head coach of our ex-women's basketball team, and he will be introducing his father, Dr. Jones.
That noise just started as I got up here. Oh, that. Okay, good. I'm really pleased to be here today. I wanted to thank St. Francis Xavier University and Rashida, Corinne, and Marie to actually put this together. I think that on a campus like this, the best thing, I'd like to have seen more students here, because I think one of your obligations as students is to learn and grow and become more mature and be able to go into the world and basically do things. And so when I'm introducing my dad, it's someone who set an example for me around putting actions to your thoughts. And as we see from the video, it's not always that the actions that you take are going to be popular. It's not always that the actions that you take are going to lead you to have more friends and those type of things. Some of the actions that you take are going to lead to stress and strife, but there's a higher purpose, and as I go through my dad's resume and some of the things that he's done, it took me like 2 hours to break down his resume into something digestible, but I do think it's important that we contextualize I give a little foreground to my dad coming up, because there's so many viewpoints about who Rocky Jones is. And I'd just like to say before I go through the list that he's a humanitarian. And a humanitarian is someone that believes in humans. And so human rights and civil rights are not just about Africans and African Canadians or African Nova Scotians. Human rights are about those people that are oppressed in a capitalist system. So I don't even like to talk anymore about what oppression is, because oppression is a fact. Just like 1 + 1 is 2. There are people in a capitalist society that's built on hierarchies that are oppressed. So as I go through this list, you're going to see that there's a misconception that Rocky Jones was only pushing for black people. And there's a big misconception there. He pushed for more than that. He pushed for anybody who is oppressed by a society that was built on the people at the top running things, and those people in a capitalist society run things through oppressing other people. It's a fact. So as we go through the history, I'd like you to keep that in mind as Rocky Jones as a humanitarian. So Burnley Allen Rocky Jones was born on August 26, 1941 in Truro, Nova Scotia. There's an area called the Marsh. It's just kind of beside CEC School there. My grandparents, Elmer and Willina Jones, had a big family. My father was one of 10 children. And also it's a family of fighters. It's just the way that we were brought up, even down to myself and my brothers and sisters. My father's grandfather, Jeremiah Jones, fought in the Battle of Vimy Ridge in 1917. He was an older gentleman who joined the Army. He thought it was a thing that he should do, and had a lot of heroics at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. And recently he got a Distinguished Medal of Honor from the Canadian government, and it was probably 60, 70 years after the fact, but the government understood that Jeremiah Jones was a man who should be honored. 1956 to 59, Rocky Jones was in the Canadian Armed Forces. And in 1965, around that region, the time my dad was in Toronto and started to get involved in what we might call movements, or I don't know if it's civil disobedience, or I don't know if it's basically standing up. But in March 1965, the Students' Union for Peace Action, acronym SUPA, demonstrated outside the U.S. consulate in Toronto. And then I'm going to go through some of the other organizations that my father was involved with, because these organizations are connected with Martin Luther King Jr. and the South and the civil rights movement there, but they were also in Canada. And there's, again, a misconception that a lot of these things that went on in the U.S. did not happen in Canada. And the person that's going to speak tonight was there in the flesh and blood during a lot of the things that were going on. So those people that are familiar with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that was involved, that was created in the South in the early 60s and the 50s. And so my father was someone that had that movement started, and some of the nonviolent principles were being used in Canada in 1960. Likewise, the Black Panthers, people would think that the Black Panthers there was a lot of negative that flowed around them. They were basically another inner city movement that was tired of getting beat up, tired of getting oppressed. And so actually my full name is Augusto, and it means Black Panther. So, you know, I was born in 1968 and put together. It's, I don't want to put Dad on the spot, but I mean, my other brother's name is Patrice Lumumba, after the first president of the Congo. My other brother's name is Shaka Zulu, who was a freedom fighter in South Africa. And my sister's names are Casey and Tracy. I don't know how we got away from that theme. But I walk with that name proudly, so people call me Augie, but my full name is Augusto. Even to the point, if you've heard of Stokely Carmichael, who became Kwame Ture, or Mariam Makeba from South Africa, who was a singer, also a freedom fighter. Little known history is that they came to Halifax to visit my father to get away from what was going on in the U.S. at the time, which was a lot of tapping of phones and following by the FBI, CIA, stuff like that. And from what I've heard, my dad can probably confirm the story, but when they got here, it was supposed to be secret, but there were RCMP officers lined up outside the airport when they got off the plane. I don't know how the RCMP knew that. Probably know how they knew it. So anyway, there's a definite connection between those movements and my father. Talking about some of the significant differences that were made in Nova Scotia, the Black United Front, which was one of the first government organizations formed in Nova Scotia that were to, again, these organizations are just there to fight for people who don't have a voice. And if you see the articulation of Dr. Martin Luther King, you'll see the articulation of my father. I think that I'm okay with words myself. One of the things that you've got to do if you are going to be a leader, or if you're just going to advocate for things, is you've got to be articulate. And so a lot of these organizations were articulating to the government some of the changes that needed to happen. So the Black United Front was pioneered by my dad. The TYP program at Dalhousie, which still exists today, it's a transition program for students who were not quite ready for university, and it sent hundreds, if not thousands of students have gone through that TYP program and become scholars. And so my dad was one of the people that started that program, and he actually taught in the program for 10 years. Another program at Dalhousie, the Indigenous Black and Mi'kmaq Law Program, was put in place by the efforts of my dad, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The African Canadian Liberation Movement, the African Canadian Caucus of Nova Scotia, Quacha House, which was an inner city program that was developed with the help of people like Walter Borden, my mother Joan Jones, Rocky Jones. In 1965 and 68, it was a way for inner city black youth to kind of organize themselves in a positive way. And so Quacha House was there for those from 65 to 68. My dad is also a historian. He has 2 degrees. He has a BA from Dalhousie from 1974 as a history major, and he has his master's from Dalhousie in 1977. So because of that, and the way that he thinks historically, and the link between the past, the present, and the future are definitely there. The Black Historical and Educational Research Organization, acronym HERO, was a project where my dad wanted to go and talk to and record some of the older people in the area. I know that the Mi'kmaq community also has that tradition. Our older people have a history that's oral, and if you don't get to them before they pass away, there's a lot of things that you lose if older people in your community pass away and you don't get their voice. And so the HERO project was set up to go to Guysborough, to Truro, to Windsor Plains, to Digby, to try to get to some of the older people in the community and just tape them and hear their stories. Again, to deal with the fact that it wasn't just about people of African descent, my father was also very interested in helping those that were in prison. So the Black Inmate Society and the Native Brotherhood at Dorchester and Spring Hill were pioneered by my dad. The women's empowerment, one of the women's empowerment movements or programs at Kingston Penitentiary was also kind of pioneered by my dad. There's a program that I do remember myself from 82 to 87 that my dad pioneered. It was a government program called ROPE, Real Opportunities for Prison Employment. And I'll explain that a bit because I thought it was a fantastic program that didn't get the funding and it went under, but a lot of times people who were in jail have a stigma to them and it's hard for them to get jobs. So this government program said that any employer that wanted to hire someone who was coming out of jail with that stigma, the government would pay 60% of their salary and ROPE would pay the other 40%. So it led to a lot of inmates because if you don't get a job, you end up going back and doing what you did that got you in jail. So it's very important that those people got jobs. Again, humanitarian. So the ROPE project was running from 82 to 87. In 1980, my dad ran for the NDP. I remember being a part of that, and it was in the Needham area in Halifax, which is a downtown area. He ran against Edmund Morris. If anyone knows the history of Halifax, Edmund Morris was the longtime mayor of Halifax. And so he came into this particular election with a lot of political savvy and money behind him. I say that because obviously I cheer for my dad. But anyway, Edmund Morris won that election that time. In 1992, and I did say to you that my dad helped create the Indigenous Black and Mi'kmaq Law Program. Well, he graduated from that program in 1992, and he was a valedictorian of the whole graduating class at the age of 50. I did want to go back and make some connections. My great-grandfather, Jeremiah, who I spoke about earlier, he enlisted in the Army when he was 58 years old. He felt that's when he went through all the programming for his first time at 58. And so when he went to the Battle of Vimy Ridge, he was in his 60s at the time. My grandmother, Augy Jones, who was a longtime teacher at Truro Junior High, she graduated from Nova Scotia Teachers College at the age of 60. And then after that, she continued a teaching career after that. So my dad getting a valedictorian at 50 means I've got a lot more to do in my life. You know, I'm really young. After my dad graduated, he formed Burnley Rocky Jones and Associates. And of course, the type of law that he was involved with was human and civil rights, criminal law, labor law, and environmental law. And I know a lot of people in here would know some of these cases. The Frederick Street residents of Sydney. If you know the story of the tar ponds, there was a lot of people that were dying and getting cancer and really didn't have they didn't have a voice. And these were not black people. These were most people on Frederick Street are not black people, but there were people who were humans and who were oppressed. So one of the cases he took on was the Frederick Street residences. He also took on a lot of the land claims, justice, and educational issues of the Aboriginal community, and I think that's a timely thing to talk about. You know, if you listen to the news, there's obviously Idle No More going on now, and again, I can appreciate that movement because, again, it's a humanitarian movement. It's not a First Nations movement. And I think that these movements will continue to be isolated and continue to be ineffective if we don't join in and say we're all human. We're all human. So for us to think that there's a women's movement and a First Nations movement and a black movement and a disabled movement, as long as we are away from and not connecting to those things, we're not going to get anywhere. There has to be a human movement. In 1997, my dad went to the Supreme Court in RDS versus the Queen, which was a case that was setting precedent for race-related litigation and the fact that some judges have biases, especially when you just had black lawyers coming to the forefront and Mi'kmaq lawyers coming to the forefront. A lot of the cases that were being judged biasly by judges who were not used to having color in the classroom. So that particular case is a precedent-setting case in Canadian legal history. In 2004, my dad was given an honorary doctorate of law from Guelph University. And in closing, many awards, and I can't go through the awards, that would take a long time to do, but many national and provincial awards have been bestowed on my dad. He also still sits on many national and provincial boards. And there's an forthcoming book from two great scholars, Dr. Jim Walker at Waterloo and Dr. George Elliott Clark at Toronto, working with my daughter, wow, it's a slip. My dad, don't have a daughter, working with my dad to create a book on the, and so I really appreciated that. And also my dad was a businessman. A lot of people don't know this. I remember it vaguely, but we had a jewelry shop that my family owned called the Blue Nile. It was in Micmac Mall, and it was in Scotia Square from 1968 to 1978. And at the time, there weren't a lot of black businesses at the time. And also, you know, as I get older and I go through some trial and tribulations, I'd say more importantly to me, he's a very wise man. He gives me a lot of advice around ways to navigate life and make some right decisions. So I really appreciated that and love him for that. And in closing, I'd like to give a statement or a quote from Dr. Stanley R. Barrett, who's a professor emeritus at the University of Guelph. And I think this really sums up the man who's going to come speak after I stop talking. He says, I have known Rocky Jones for almost 40 years, and I've been associated with him in several activities. In addition, in my capacity as a Canadian historian, I've researched and written about his role in the evolution of human rights in Canada. I can think of few living Canadians who have done more to further the cause of racial equality and the rights of the disadvantaged in our country than Mr. Rocky Jones. Thank you.